4 years of war drastically changed the social, political, and economic landscapes of Europe and the Middle East. Empires that existed in 1914 were broken up by 1919. Millions had been killed and millions more displaced from their homes. In this lesson, we will explore more in depth how the war and its subsequent peace treaty reshaped borders and populations in the decade following the end of the Great War, and look closely at what social and economic challenges were confronted by survivors of the conflict. The breakup of the Ottoman Empire also led to the creation of new countries as well as lands in transition, which were known as mandates. Back in 1916, Britain, France, and Imperial Russia had signed a pact known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a plan to divide the Ottoman Empire into spheres of British, French, and Russian influence in the event of an Allied victory. Russia remained absorbed in a post-Bolshevik revolution, civil war after the Great War ended. This left Britain and France to follow through with creating mandates of administration in the Middle East. Mandates were areas of land that were set up to eventually become independent countries. Mandates were temporarily placed under the supervision of a colonial power as they made their transition from territory to nation. Turkey became the primary successor state to the Ottoman Empire. In the Levant, or the area of the Middle East that touches the eastern Mediterranean Sea, the mandates of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq were formed. Syria and Lebanon were placed under temporary French control. Lebanon and northern Syria were both home to large indigenous Christian populations, including many Armenians who had fled genocide in Ottoman Turkey. Palestine and Transjordan were placed under British mandate, as was Iraq. Iraq, formerly known as Mesopotamia, had seen heavy fighting between British and Ottoman forces during the war. The population of Iraq was split between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, with some settlements of Assyrian Christian and ethnic minority Kurds. Sectarian violence or clashes between members of different ethnic and religious groups was a problem for Iraq during the British Mandate period. A massacre of Assyrian Christians in the village of Simele in August of 1933 tested the ability of the British administrators to keep the peace in Mandate of Iraq. Transjordan was sparsely populated, but the Mandate of Palestine quickly became a contentious zone. In the late 19th century, Jews from the Russian Empire and other parts of Eastern Europe had begun settling in this land. Jews in Eastern Europe were fleeing pogroms, or incidences of mob violence against religious minorities. Those who fled hoped to establish a permanent homeland for Jewish people in the biblical land of Israel, which was part of the Mandate of Palestine. Palestine was home to an Arabic-speaking Muslim majority, along with a smaller population of Arab Christians. Tensions between the Jewish arrivals from Europe and the local people soon broke out. In the November 1917 Balfour Declaration, Great Britain pledged to assist Jewish settlers in establishing their own state in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was named for British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour. European Jewish settlers in Palestine continued to campaign to set up a new nation on land with a diverse population composite. Back in Geneva, Switzerland, the League of Nations was attempting to find its place as an international organization in the post-war world. The U.S. not joining the League came as a significant blow. With 42 member countries, the League was dominated by Britain and France. The Russian Soviet Union was not invited to join the League, and Germany was isolated from it for much of the 1920s. Post-war Europe faced a tremendous refugee crisis. A refugee is defined as a person who flees home due to war or political persecution. Close to 500,000 Belgian civilians had fled to the Netherlands, and many French civilians were internally displaced. The area surrounding the Eastern Front produced a great many displaced persons. Many ethnic Poles and Ukrainians fled westward into the urban areas of Austria and Hungary. With new borders drawn after the war, many people ended up residing as ethnic minorities in new countries where hostility and discrimination pervaded daily life. For example, ethnic Germans in the new Polish and Czechoslovakian nations frequently faced animosity due to lingering anti-German sentiment. During and after the war, Great Britain faced discontent within its empire. In the middle of the Great War, pro-independence efforts in Ireland continued. The April 1916 Easter Rising was instigated by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB. The IRB was a political faction that was not willing to wait for the end of the war to resume the Irish cause for independence. By April 23rd, members of the IRB had armed themselves and occupied key sites in the city of Dublin. British reinforcements were brought in swiftly and succeeded in crushing the uprising. The British victory meant the execution of the 15 leaders from the IRB and a tightening of British control over Ireland. Between 1919 and 1921, the Irish rebels fought again, finally succeeding in winning independence for Ireland by June of 1922. Elsewhere in the British Empire, independence movements continued to foment. Colonial troops from India had served in the British wartime forces, suffering heavy casualties. This service reinvigorated the call for Indian independence from Britain, especially from Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi had been born in the province of Gujarat, educated in Britain, and practiced law in South Africa. In 1915, Gandhi returned to India with his passionate message of self-rule for India. Gandhi and his supporters advocated the use of non-violent resistance to achieve Swaraj, or self-rule for the people of India. Boycotts of British-made cloth in favor of local khadi, or hand-woven fabrics, were implemented in the 1920s. To protest the British tax on salt, Gandhi and his followers led the Dandi March, as Dandi is the Hindi word for salt. This series of India-wide protest marches were met with British police suppression from 1930 to 1931. While India independence was not achieved until 1947, the seeds of the self-rule movement had been firmly planted in the decade following the Great War. The world, post-Great War, was a changed place, with new nations, millions of displaced persons, lingering resentments, border disputes, and colonial struggles for independent rule. Many new nations in Eastern Europe struggled to build functioning governments, and the 1920s saw the rise of authoritarian dictators in countries like Hungary, where social cohesion remained tenuous. So let's review some key points from this lesson on the aftermath of the Great War. After the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, following the end of the war, territories that were scheduled to become independent nations were placed under temporary foreign administrative systems known as A. Self-rule, B. Displacement, C. Mandates, D. Reparations. If you choose C. Mandates, you're correct.